I live alone, so who keeps writing messages on my mirror? I turned 18 in 2008, and on the day of my birthday, for reasons I won't bore you with, I packed up my things and moved out. For 4 years, I lived in my car, working as a barista from 6 to 2 and as a line cook from 4 to 10. My plan was to work until I had enough money for my own place, and then to either go to college or get a more stable job. Looking back on it now, I don't know how I did it. But by 22, I'd saved up a decent sum of money and began my hunt for a semi-permanent place of residence. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and though housing prices weren't as bad as they are now, it was still a pricey county. After months of asking around, I was connected with Anders, an elderly man who was leasing a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house in North Hollywood for far below market rate. The catch, because there's always a catch when it comes to affordable housing, was that the house had been terribly maintained. It had been unoccupied for a year and would need some serious TLC before most people could comfortably reside in it. I, however, had been living out of a car for 4 years. As long as the place had running water, it would be an upgrade for me. I moved into the house in fall 2012. Anders gave me a tour before I got settled. He was a short, joyful old man. Well-meaning, but, how do I put this? Maybe not the most focused as a result of his age. At one point during the tour, he showed me the bathroom, then the master bedroom, then the bathroom again, then the master bedroom again. He was about to walk into the bathroom for a third time before I gently guided him down the hall. The house itself was livable but weathered. Dim lighting from outdated fixtures cast long shadows over peeling wallpaper. The ceiling in many of the rooms was discolored from past leaks. The faucet in the kitchen sink was broken. The bathtub was badly chipped, and a few of the cabinet handles fell off in my hand. It was a rundown place, located in a bars on the window kind of neighborhood, but still, it was my place. I was smiling ear to ear when Anders gave me the keys. "It's a good house with good bones. You take care of it now," he instructed, which I found ironic. Before he left, he paused in the front doorway, drawing a hand to his chin as he looked behind me into the house. I tried to follow his gaze, but couldn't figure out what he was looking at. "Everything all right?" "Yes. Just that something looks different about that bathroom, though I can't put my finger on what. Ah, well, it's a good house with good bones. You take care of it now." And with that, he gave me a nod and left me to my unpacking. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed living in a house. I didn't care how run down the place was. Just having an accessible bathroom and a full-size mattress to sleep on made me feel like a king. After I'd spent a few days cleaning the place up, I invited my sister and her fiancé over for dinner. I'm sure it sounds stupid, but my newly acquired ability to host company made me proud. In no time at all, I'd comfortably settled into my new home. That evening, after saying goodbye to my guests, I took a shower. The bathroom lacked a traditional above-the-sink mirror. Instead, it had a wide, full-length mirror mounted on the wall to the left of the vanity. When I exited the shower and stepped up to the glass, raising a hand to wipe away the fog, I noticed something odd. In the condensation, right at my eye level, was the word "hi." I didn't know what to make of it. Somehow the letters seemed intentional. It was hard to pass off as simply the way the steam had settled. My sister had been in the bathroom just before she left. Maybe she had written the word on the mirror with her fingertip, and the steam had only made the letters visible after my shower. I almost texted her about it, but the message seemed ridiculous when I typed it out. Paranoid, even. I wiped the mirror down and turned in for the night, and soon I forgot about it entirely. The following week, I received a promotion at one of my jobs, and while I was grateful for the additional income, my new position meant longer days. Additionally, I realized that a few of the house repairs were beyond my ability, and so I started outsourcing some work to contractors. It was annoying to only have the house to myself at night, but I didn't have another option with my busy schedule. Things were generally progressing smoothly, though every once in a while in the middle of the night I would be awoken by a sound that I couldn't quite place. When I next noticed writing on my mirror, I had been living at the house for a month. The second sighting occurred in much the same way as the first. I came back home after work and took a shower. When I pushed back the shower curtain, I looked at the glass and saw, written in the condensation, the words, Staying long? Now I could pass 2 letters off as a coincidence, but 2 words, an entire question? That was no coincidence. Someone had been in my bathroom, and recently. I had contractors in and out of my house all the time, so one of them could have written the message, but why? I got dressed and put a hand on the bathroom doorknob about to go back into my bedroom when it occurred to me that whoever had written the message might still be around. I slowly cracked open the door, peering down the dark hallway in one direction then the other. I listened very carefully, but heard nothing. I walked around my house, which didn't take long given its size, and looked for anything out of place. All of my doors were locked, all of my windows were shut, and none of my personal items had been disturbed. If someone had broken into my house, they were long gone by the time I looked around. That second message put me on edge for days. I triple-checked that my windows and doors were locked each night. I looked in every potential hiding spot, of which there were few in my little house, after I came home from work and before I went to sleep. And yet, though I was certain that my house was secure, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. A month passed without incident. I had almost started to feel at home in my new lodgings again until one Friday morning, I awoke just past 3 a.m. I couldn't immediately tell what had woken me. Often the house settled at night, creaking and groaning in ways that made it sound alive. But in that moment, the house was silent. It was only after I turned my head to the side did I realize that my bedroom door, which I was certain I had shut, was wide open. I stared down the hallway, feeling as though I were gazing into a black hole. The darkness was abyssal. I kept waiting for my eyes to adjust, waiting for them to pick out the familiar shapes of my home. But they never did. I couldn't see a thing, so why did I feel like something could see me? Like there was something in the house with me, just feet beyond the threshold to my bedroom, watching, waiting. Somehow I found the courage to rise from my bed and walk toward the door. When I made it to the handle, I grabbed it and slammed the door shut. I didn't investigate further, didn't so much as stick my head out into the hall for a closer look. My bedroom door didn't have a lock. None of the doors except the bathroom did. So I dragged my bookcase in front of the door. It was a small bookcase, and an intruder could probably ram the door open anyway if they wanted to, but not before the sound alerted me. When morning came and I had to leave the house for work, I genuinely considered exiting my house through the window. I was almost late by the time I worked up the nerve myself to look around my house before I left. As always, I found nothing amiss. After work, when I reluctantly returned home for the night, I ate a quick dinner and hopped in the shower. I remember standing in the tub for a long time, mulling over my predicament. I'd heard horror stories about people secretly living in other people's homes. Maybe I had become a victim of a frog without even knowing. But if that was the case, then where the hell were they? There was nowhere to hide in that tiny house. I'd torn the place apart multiple times by then, checking every cabinet and closet. The inside of the house couldn't be accessed from the crawl space, and the air vents were too small for a person to fit in. Suddenly I heard a click, so tiny that I'd almost missed it entirely. I tore back the shower curtain, gripping the shampoo bottle like I was about to bludgeon an intruder to death with it. As I'd come to expect, there was no one in the room, but there was a new message on the mirror. This one was bold, the easiest to read of any of the messages I'd received so far. It was 3 words long. I see you. Some awful amalgam of fear, confusion, and anger made my stomach churn. Ultimately, the latter emotion rose above the rest. I hastily dried off and threw on some clothes, then grabbed my phone from where I'd left it on the bathroom counter. I punched in Anders' number and glared at that damn mirror as I listened to the phone ring again and again. I'd started to think it was too late for him to be awake when he suddenly picked up. He started to ask me how I was faring in my new lodgings before I cut him off. I need you to tell me if there's some way that a person could be getting into the house, I said. Every night, I check every window and door. I check every cupboard, closet, and cabinet, and still things are amiss. You need to let me know if there's some entry point that I'm not aware of. Anders didn't seem to entirely understand what I was asking. What? What's getting in? You let me know if you're having rat troubles. My last tenant before you had rat trouble sometimes. Yeah, sure, I've got rats. Besides the doors and the windows, how could they be getting in? Well, there's the vents, of course, and there was a chimney once, though we had it sealed up a good long while ago. And there's also the crawl space, of course, though I'm sure you've already poked around down there. Though I knew the home had a crawl space, I'd never had much reason to investigate it. I was never able to find the entrance, even after ripping up all the carpeting in the house. Likely, hardwood had been installed over the access door, making it an unlikely point of entry for an intruder. How do I get down to the crawl space? Yes, you should give the crawl space a gander. I barely stopped myself from smashing the phone into the counter. I plan to. Where can I find the entrance? That'll be on the floor of the bathroom closet. I looked around the room. Surely, I'd misheard him. Either that or he was confused again. What? I know, it's an odd place for it, but it's only there because that room didn't always used to be a bathroom. The bathroom doesn't have a closet. Sure it does. Just to the left of the vanity. I looked at the mirror. At that long, oversized mirror. I'd always found it odd for a bathroom of that size to have a built-in floor-to-ceiling mirror. What was it that Anders had said when he'd first visited? That something had looked different about the bathroom? Setting my phone down next to the sink, I stepped up close to the glass. I spent a few moments feeling around the frame, looking for a latch. Then I grabbed a portion of the right side of the frame in two hands. After one hard yank, the mirror swung open like a door, revealing a large walk-in closet. Anders was saying something on the other end of the line, but I was too stunned to answer. There was a square-shaped hole at the back of the closet, which I assumed led down to the crawl space beneath the house. The closet floor was littered with all kinds of trash, filthy sheets, fast food containers, beer cans, and I realized some of my own items. Little things I thought I'd misplaced. A sock, a toothbrush, a comb, and a small framed photograph of me, my sister, and our old family dog. I crouched down to pick up the photo, perched in the doorway as I studied my younger, smiling self. I heard Anders saying my name over the phone, except the voice didn't sound much like Anders at all. It was too deep, too clear, too close. When I looked up, a man was peeking out at me from the hole in the floor. He smiled at me, his eyes wide and pupils blown, his smile so wide it looked painful, and his hair long and matted. He was only visible from the neck up, and the harsh lighting made it look like a disembodied head was grinning at me from the back of the closet. Horrified, I rose to my feet and ran. I didn't stop running until I made it to my car, which I promptly drove to my sister's house. The next day, I drove to the police station to file a report. An officer met me at the house to check the scene, and I showed him the hidden closet, which indeed had an entrance to the crawl space. My best guess was that the intruder was entering my crawl space from the small door on the side of my house. He'd likely been squatting in the house during the year in which it sat unoccupied, and when he saw it was being prepared for sale, he had disguised the closet door so as to keep a little room for himself. Why he decided to stay or why he was leaving me messages, I can't say. From his actions and from what little I saw of him, I think it's safe to assume that he wasn't of sound mind. Unfortunately, the man was never found. For all I know, he's still in that same neighborhood. Hell, he might even be in the same house. I moved across the county afterwards and have lived in studio apartments ever since. The thought of living in a big house with all those rooms and corners and places to hide gives me the creeps. It's not just houses that the incident soured for me, but mirrors as well. These days, when I visit a friend or stay at a hotel, I always have to carefully inspect the bathroom mirrors, shining a light directly into their faces and tapping a finger against the glass. Because the worst detail of the whole ordeal was that, when revisiting the bathroom with the police officer, I stepped into the old closet, closed the door, and looked into the mirror. Instead of the mirror backing, I saw the officer's face on the other side of the glass. I took a job as a watchman in the Bavarian forest. The previous watchman never really left. The Bavarian forest in southwestern Germany spans about 6,000 square kilometers across Baden-Württemberg. Follow it far enough, and it merges with the Šumava along the Czech border, eventually leading to the Grosser Rachel Peak region. This area, known as the Rachelgebiet, is considered the heart of the Bavarian forest, a place where human activity is strictly prohibited. though not for the reasons most believe. Much of the Reichelgebiet was once part of the Iron Curtain, a division that kept people and nations carefully separated from the end of World War II through the Cold War. The threat of encountering hostile forces kept the majority of people out, allowing nature to reclaim the land untouched, or so they say. Entire swathes of fallen trees lay where storms dropped them decades ago, rotting quietly in the perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. No trails, no clearings, no signs of civilization. Just an endless forest so dense you could walk for days without seeing direct sunlight. I'm telling you this now to highlight how isolated and ancient this little part of our world is, and perhaps to explain why no one noticed when people started disappearing. You can imagine my surprise when I got the job. I'd just been fired from a warehouse logistics role. My interim boss at the time was a 24-year-old Nepo plant, running the place whilst his father was on vacation. The heir apparent was short-tempered and arrogant. One of those types who think they know everything about running a business because they've read Rich Dad, Poor Dad and follow Gary Vee on Instagram. So when I warned him that scheduling the bulk wine deliveries during vintage season would overwhelm our already maxed out cold storage, 300 containers of temperature-sensitive stock with nowhere to go but the 40-degree loading bay, I did so with the kind of numb acceptance that comes from watching a train wreck in slow motion. The numbers were clear as day. Our facility could handle maybe 60 containers max, and that's if we Tetrised them in there like our lives depended on it. The rest would sit out in the Queensland sun, slowly cooking into very expensive vinegar. But my words just floated through that empty chasm between his ears and disappeared into the nether, probably to join all the other ignored warnings from people who actually knew what they were talking about. So come 5, the workers walked, leaving behind a ghost town of half-stacked pallets and beeping forklifts low on charge. The first trucks were already lined up outside, drivers getting antsy in their cabs, paperwork clutched in sweaty hands. By morning, it'd be a shit show. I remember standing in that empty warehouse looking up at the mountains of boxes we'd somehow have to deal with, and knew if I came in tomorrow, my ass would be handed to me by some private-educated ponce with a business degree I'd bet good money he paid someone else to earn. So I left my vest and company-issued hard hat in my office, dropped my pass and forklift keys into the after-hours post slot, and walked out. Drove home in my beat-up Commodore, windows down because the AC had died 2 summers ago, and I'd never bothered fixing it. Blocked every number in my phone still related to that place, cracked open a beer, and started looking for a new job. That's when I found the listing for the Watchtower position. The job listing was sparse on details but heavy on requirements. Posted by the Brides of Christendom, a religious organization I'd heard whispers about, mostly the kind you'd expect from people who think anything more organized than a Sunday service must be hiding something. They had deep pockets, that much was clear from the salary they were offering. 6 figures for what amounted to glorified data collection in the middle of nowhere? I'd have been suspicious if I wasn't so desperate. If I'd been thinking clearly, I might have wondered why they needed someone so far from their usual territory. I remembered that mess with Kirby Leedy a few years back. Everyone did. She'd gone out to their compound in Warlpiri country to do an expose on what she called Australia's most dangerous cult. Years later, they found what was left of her buried under the red dirt. The investigation went nowhere. No evidence, they said. Just circumstantial links that weren't enough for charges. The compound shut down soon after, leaving nothing but empty buildings and unanswered questions baking in the outback sun. But here's the thing. I knew a guy called Mason who'd done their grocery deliveries out there for years. Real straight shooter type, not the kind to sugarcoat anything. He swore up and down that the women there were nothing but kind. Just trying to live their faith, he'd said over beers one night. Media got it all wrong, mate. Those ladies wouldn't hurt a fly. Besides, this position wasn't even in Australia. It was halfway across the world in a forest I'd never heard of until now. The requirements were specific. They wanted someone strong, with mountaineering experience. Fair enough, given the location. But then they went on about extraordinary attention to detail and the ability to take scientific readings. The listing emphasized, almost defensively, that no science background was necessary, however. They were more interested in someone with passion for nature and dedication to environmental preservation. We believe that true understanding of nature comes from devotion rather than education, the posting read. The right candidate will share our commitment to protecting God's creation through careful observation and documentation. It was a 12-month contract, no renewals possible. That struck me as odd. Usually these kinds of positions want someone they can train up and keep, but they were clear. 1 year, no exceptions. The job involved manning one of their watchtowers solo, taking regular readings that they didn't specify. They'd provide training, they said. Every second weekend, I'd meet with a Brides of Christendom representative to hand over my data, which would supposedly help with their environmental conservation efforts. Your work will contribute to our understanding of natural cycles and help preserve the delicate balance of God's creation, the listing continued. It was vague enough to sound meaningful while saying absolutely nothing concrete. Like a horoscope or a prophecy, words you could pour any meaning into depending on what you wanted to hear. The isolation part didn't bother me. After dealing with that walking management disaster at the warehouse, a year of minimal human contact sounded like heaven. They'd provide food, accommodation, and all necessary equipment. The pay was enough to set me up nicely afterward, maybe start that ginger beer line I'd had brewing for a while. I was a pretty experienced hiker, was familiar with most of the major peaks in the world, even taught an abseiling class in Croatia for a while in my mid-20s. I took another swig of beer and started filling out the application. Sometimes the devil you don't know is better than the one you do, even if that devil happens to be a religious organization with a questionable past and very specific requirements for watching trees in Germany. Radio silence followed my application. 2 weeks of refreshing my email and jumping every time my phone buzzed. I picked up temp work loading trucks. The irony wasn't lost on me, and tried not to think about how quickly my savings were dwindling. In hindsight, they were probably waiting, watching, assessing my desperation level, making sure I was in exactly the right state of mind when they made their offer. Your application was very strong, she said cheerfully, after introducing herself as Sister Catherine. Tell me a little more about your background. I mentioned my warehouse work, inventory management, quality control. Heavily stressed a lifelong interest in nature, even found a way to mention that one time I backed up an entire highway to save a yellow-tailed cockatoo from Pancake City. Eventually she prodded, "And your scientific background?" "None, really. Basic high school stuff. Bit of chemistry in first-year uni before I dropped out." There was a pause, then a sound I could have sworn was satisfaction. "Good, very good. We find those with too much formal education often struggle with our methods. Our approach is more holistic, but we're confident in the results we've seen so far." The questions continued. Had I ever lived alone for extended periods? Was I comfortable with isolation? Could I follow precise instructions without deviation? Then, almost casually, "Are you a man of faith, Mr. Davies?" "No," I admitted. "Never really took to it." She laughed, a warm sound that seemed genuinely amused. "That's quite common among our watchmen, though they all leave believing one way or another." The call ended abruptly with a promise to be in touch. A week later, an email arrived from their HR department. I had the job. A woman, another Catherine oddly, handled the logistics, plane tickets, necessary paperwork, a list of what to bring. I spent the next month wrapping up my life, found someone to take over my lease, stored my furniture at my parents' place, sold what I couldn't store. The flight to Munich felt surreal. From there, I caught a train to Zwiesel, a small town that serves as one of the main gateways to the Bavarian forest. A woman in a white robe was waiting at the station, holding a sign with my name. Sister Mary, she introduced herself. All smiles and enthusiastic German-accented English. We drove for hours in a sensible Volkswagen, deeper and deeper into the forest. The roads got narrower, the trees taller, until the canopy above formed an unbroken ceiling that turned afternoon into perpetual twilight. Sister Elsa chatted the whole way about the forest's history, the Bride of Christendom's conservation work, how blessed they were to have another watchman. The tower appeared suddenly, a stark silhouette against the darkening sky. Modern construction despite its isolated location, rising maybe 40 meters above the trees. My home for the next year. "Now," Sister Elsa said, unfolding a map on the tower's small table. "You have 12 locations to monitor." She traced a perfect circle around the tower, marking each point. Each requires different readings. The next 2 hours were a crash course in data collection. Soil samples at points 1 through 4, using a special probe that measured something she called resonance. Air quality readings at points 5 through 8, with a device that looked more like an antique compass than any scientific instrument I'd seen. The last 4 points needed water samples from streams, tested with strips that changed colors in patterns I was told to document but not interpret. "Every Sunday," she explained, "you will take the trail to Spiegelau, 5 hours each way. You'll meet one of our sisters at the Waldkirche at noon to deliver your readings and receive supplies." The training felt rushed, inadequate for the precision they seemed to want. But before I could ask for clarification, Sister Elsa was heading for her car. "The Lord's work awaits," she said cheerfully. "You'll do fine." Then she was gone, leaving me alone in a tower that suddenly felt very tall and very isolated. The single room at the top was sparse but functional. Bed, kitchenette, bathroom behind a partition. The windows wrapped all the way around, giving me a 360-degree view of absolutely nothing but darkening forest. Perfect visibility in every direction, like a fishbowl. I unpacked my bags, trying to make the space feel more like home. Everything felt fresh, almost surgically so. This place had plenty of fresh air, but I could smell the lingering afterburn of rubbing alcohol, as if this place had received a deep clean before I moved in. Thoughtful. Once I made my bed, I tried to settle in for the night. But as the last enduring rays of the sun disappeared and the forest plunged into absolute darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from those trees, looking up at my brightly lit box in the sky. At the time, I laughed it off. I'd spent a good chunk of my life camping and scaring myself shitless. The human imagination is inexorably linked with our primate brain. The mind feeds you images of moving shadows and ghouls under beds and murderers in darkened alleyways. It's a way of keeping you on your toes, keeping you alive. So I summed up those feelings of unease that night to little more than my imagination. As always, I should have listened to my gut. The first month passed easily enough. I developed a routine. Wake at dawn, make coffee, check the weather. The readings took most of the morning. A perfect circle through the forest, each point marked by a small metal stake driven into the ground. I'd document everything in a leather-bound logbook they'd provided, filling page after page with numbers I didn't understand. The soil probe would hum at different frequencies, displaying readings in units I'd never heard of. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at it for minutes at a time, watching the needle bounce meaninglessly back and forth until the damp from the ground would seep through my pants and snap me back to awareness. The air quality device looked like something from a steampunk novel, with brass dials that moved in patterns that seemed to follow no logical system I could discern. The water test strips would bloom in complex color patterns, not just changing to a single shade, but developing intricate designs like tiny abstract paintings. Beautiful, really. I'd find myself mesmerized by them, watching the colors swirl and merge until the morning light had somehow slipped into afternoon. Sundays became my favorite day. I'd leave before sunrise for the long trek to Spiegelau, watching the forest wake up around me. Sometimes I'd pass clearings that seemed too perfectly circular, or stumble upon old equipment I assumed belonged to previous watchmen. A rusted thermos here, a torn backpack there, once even what looked like a full set of clothes laid out as if their owner had simply evaporated. The town itself was small but alive, a shock of civilization after 6 days of solitude. I'd submit my readings to whichever sister was assigned that week, trying not to notice how intently they studied my face, my movements, before they even glanced at the logbook. Then I'd treat myself to a proper meal at the local guest house, something that wasn't from a can or the tower's cramped freezer. I was 4 weeks in and never wanted to touch Spam again in my life. The owner of the restaurant we would meet in never seemed to remember me from week to week, though I was surely one of his few regular customers. Maybe all us watchmen just looked the same to him after a while. I tried Googling the devices I used for the readings during these brief windows of connectivity, but found nothing even remotely similar. Searches for other watchmen's experiences came up empty. When I casually asked one of the sisters about previous watchmen, she smiled that serene smile they all seemed to share and said, "The watchtower is new and so is your position. There weren't any watchmen before you." They also sprung health checks on me. Took longer than submitting the readings. The health checks were exhaustive. Blood pressure, reflexes, muscle tone, coordination tests. They'd shine lights in my eyes, test my hearing, measure my heart rate after basic exercises. One sister would take detailed notes while another performed the tests, their pens scratching against paper with the same methodical precision as my measurement devices in the forest. Sometimes I'd catch them exchanging glances, making small marks in margins. Then came the questions, always the same. How is your motivation level? Are you maintaining your energy throughout the day? Describe your sleep patterns. Rate your overall sense of purpose from 1 to 10. They'd inspect everything I bought before I headed back. Food, supplies, even magazines. Certain materials can interfere with the readings, they'd explain. Modern chemicals, electronic devices, some dyes. We must protect the purity of our work. Once, when I bought an extra coffee maker for the tower, Sister Agnes almost seemed alarmed. She confiscated it immediately, muttering something about artificial stimulation corrupting natural patterns. I learned to line my socks with sachets of instant coffee. Some things I just wasn't willing to give up. It all seemed excessive but well-intentioned. Until things started to change. It began with sleep. I'd always been an early riser, but suddenly I was sleeping through my alarms. I'd wake groggy, disoriented, sometimes well past noon. The sisters noticed. Of course they did. Quite normal, they assured me during the health checks, making those little marks in their notebooks. The forest has its own rhythm. Best not to fight it. My appetite disappeared. Dishes piled up in the sink because the thought of washing them felt overwhelming. My daily hikes became shorter, then stopped altogether. I'd sit in the tower's single chair for hours, staring at the trees, thinking nothing. Sometimes I'd wake up to find I'd been sitting there so long the sun had set, though I couldn't remember what I'd been thinking about or even if I'd been thinking at all. Depression, I thought. I'd experienced it once. It was something like this. The caffeine pills and energy drinks I smuggled back helped, but only barely. The sisters never found them in their inspections. I'd gotten good at hiding things, but sometimes I wondered if they knew anyway. They'd give me these knowing looks during the health checks, especially when testing my reflexes or measuring my pulse. The younger ones would seem almost excited, while the older sisters would nod with grim satisfaction, as if I were confirming something they'd suspected all along. I told myself it was the altitude, or seasonal affect disorder, or simple isolation. But I'd done solo work before. I'd lived alone. This was different. It wasn't just tiredness. It was like something was slowly draining away my will to do anything at all. Even writing in my personal journal became an effort. The entries grew shorter, then stopped altogether. The last one before this just trails off mid-sentence, as if I'd forgotten what I was trying to say, or why I was trying to say it at all. Then came the nights. The first time I saw one, I was about to head out for a late evening reading. Just a figure at first, moving between the trees. It looked like a man, but something was wrong about the way it moved. Sluggish, dreamlike, as if every step required immense effort, one foot dragging itself after the other, stumbling over roots and through thickets. It would stop for long periods, head limp and lolling against its shoulder, swaying slightly, as if it had forgotten what it was doing or where it was going. I watched through the tower windows, telling myself it was just another hiker, though I knew no one else was supposed to be out here. but there was something familiar about the way it was dressed. Heavy boots, weatherproof jacket, the kind of gear I wore for my readings. With the aid of a pair of binoculars, I could see dark stains on their clothing, patches where the fabric had started to rot. They kept appearing, always at the edge of my vision, always just as the sun set. Sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, just lingering among the tree line. Their movement seemed wrong, like people moving through thick syrup or a video played at quarter speed. Sometimes they'd just stop mid-step and stay there, swaying slightly for hours. I know because I watched one once, unable to look away, until dawn started creeping over the trees. As the light touched him, he seemed to stir slightly before shuffling deeper into the forest. I found their traces during my daily readings, boot prints walking in aimless circles, old equipment scattered about, rusted soil probes, torn backpacks, logbooks so water-damaged the pages had fused together. Once I found a jacket identical to mine draped over a tree branch. The name tag was still legible. Richard K., Tower 4. The fabric crumbled when I touched it. The worst part was the silence. The forest should have been full of night sounds, owls, small animals, wind in the trees. But whenever they appeared, everything went quiet. Like the whole forest was holding its breath. Or like these wandering figures had somehow drawn all the life and energy from the air itself. I stopped going out after dark, started double-checking my locks, tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Then came the crackle from beneath the floorboards. At first, I thought I was imagining it, another trick of an increasingly unreliable mind. But no, there it was again. A static burst, followed by what sounded like a voice. I found the loose board near my bed, and underneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, an old walkie-talkie and a pack of fresh batteries. "Hello?" The voice was clear, accented, but eerily tired. "New guy, you there?" I hesitated before responding. My fingers felt clumsy on the talk button, like they were forgetting how to work. "Who is this?" "Jabari. I'm in Tower 7, about 15 kilometers northeast. Been here 10 months now." His voice had an urgency to it, but also a heaviness, like each word was an effort. "Had a relationship with your predecessor, but he just disappeared one day." "Disappeared? What do you mean?" "You're Tower 6. You won't last long either. They never do." None of his words made sense to me at the time, but they still put the fear of God into me. "He left all his stuff," Jabari continued as though to himself. "Even his readings. Thought I think I saw him last week wandering near my tower. He couldn't. He trailed off." My heart was pounding, though the effort of holding the walkie-talkie was already making my arm tired. "We're not supposed to have contact with other watchmen." "No shit." A dry laugh, followed by a long pause. So long I thought he'd fallen asleep. "Finally. But there are things in this forest they don't tell us about. Things you've probably started to notice. Share your readings with me. I've got a theory." "This could be a test," I cut him off. "From the sisters." Another laugh, but harder this time. "Fine. But when you start to see them, really see them, and you start to suspect what I suspect, I'm here until the end of September. I'll keep my walkie close." His voice dropped lower. "If I'm still here." The transmission ended. I sat there in the darkness, staring at the device in my hands, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Outside, the forest had gone quiet again, and in the distance, barely visible in the moonlight, a figure in a weatherproof jacket stood perfectly still between the trees, head tilted at an odd angle, as if it had forgotten where it was going, or what it once was. It's wild how fiercely your mind fights to rationalize things, even when every instinct in your gut is screaming that something's wrong. I clung to denial, desperate to believe that ignoring the signs might somehow strip away the horror and leave behind a mundane, harmless explanation. So I turned off the walkie-talkie, yanked out the battery for good measure, and forced myself, through sheer Herculean effort, to complete my tasks each day. All the while, my energy and will seemed to drain away hour by hour, as if the very act of existing was bleeding me dry. Looking back, I should have noticed sooner how wrong the forest was. Not dead. Everything was technically alive, but existing in a kind of half-life. Birds would perch on branches for hours, barely moving. Foxes wouldn't chase rabbits, but simply wait, conserving energy, until their prey grew too lethargic to hop away. Even the insects seemed sluggish, their wing beats visible in the thick air. I once watched a wolf pack take down a deer. They didn't chase it, just followed, walking for days until it forgot how to run. My own decline was becoming impossible to ignore. Yesterday I noticed with growing horror how dark my urine had become and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd had water. 2 days? 3? The fear that came with that realization was enough to push me into forcing down 2 liters in one sitting. I felt the water soothe my raw, parched throat, but the expected satisfaction never came. No relief, no gratitude from my body, just a hollow, almost mournful acceptance, as though it knew this vital resource was far too little, far too late. Last Sunday, after what should have been a leisurely 5-hour trek took me almost 8, I broke down and told Sister Agnes I was scared. She didn't seem surprised. Just asked me to hold on 1 more week while they arranged a replacement. Her calm felt rehearsed, like she'd had this conversation before. That was 5 days ago. I haven't taken a reading since. The devices sit in their case, humming their meaningless songs to no one. This morning I tried to make it to Spiegelau. I couldn't wait for Sunday. Not after another night of those things circling the tower, their rotting faces turned up toward my windows. Not after I noticed my fingernails had started turning black at the beds, or how my gums bled when I bothered to brush my teeth. The human body can only go so long without proper nutrition before it starts eating itself. I packed a day bag with what felt like lead weights. Every item, water bottle, compass, emergency kit, seemed to weigh 10 times what it should. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to zip the bag closed. The mirror caught my reflection as I headed for the door. Sunken eyes and a gray face, cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows. I didn't recognize myself. The forest was bright when I set out, morning sun streaming through the canopy. I'd made this trek dozens of times before. 5 hours to town, 5 hours to help. Simple. The first kilometer was like walking through wet cement. Each step required conscious effort. Lift foot, move forward, place down, repeat. My muscles felt like they were filled with sand. I kept checking behind me, certain I'd see them following, but there was only empty forest. The silence felt anticipatory, like the whole woods was holding its breath, watching. By the second kilometer, I was stopping every few minutes to rest. My vision would blur, then clear, then blur again. The path seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, twisting in ways I didn't remember. Had it always been this steep? This winding question mark? My heart pounded with effort that would have been nothing a month ago. I started talking to myself, trying to maintain focus. 1 foot, then the other, just like that. Keep moving. My voice sounded wrong in the thick air, like it was coming from somewhere else. Someone else. The weight came gradually. Not physical, something deeper. Like gravity itself was increasing, pulling me toward the earth. My shoulders curved under it. My spine wanted to bend. Every few steps I had to remind myself why I was walking, where I was going, who I was. I don't remember falling. Just the suddenly close view of dead leaves, the damp smell of soil. My cheek pressed against the earth, and I could have sworn I felt it pulling at me, trying to draw me down and deep. I should get up, I thought. Should keep moving. But why? The thought came with strange clarity. Why fight it? The ground was soft, the air was warm. I was so tired. My eyes closed. When they opened again, it was night. I've never been in these woods after dark. Never really understood why that was such a strict rule until now. The panic gave me enough energy to stumble to my feet. The tower was closer than town, maybe 40 minutes in my current state. I pulled out my flashlight and forced myself to move. The beam seemed weak, as if the darkness here was something physical, something that could push back against the light. That's when I heard them. Footsteps, all around me. Not coordinated enough to be walking, but not random enough to be stumbling. The sound of dragging feet through dead leaves coming from every direction at once. The beam of my flashlight caught glimpses, figures in various states of decay, wearing the tattered remains of weatherproof gear. Their skin was gray where it wasn't black with rot, stretched tight over bones. Some still had name tags, some still had faces. I recognized one, Richard K. from Tower 4, whose jacket I'd found. His flesh had the waxy texture of a corpse, but his chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths. His eyes were clouded but aware, tracking my movement with terrible recognition. His mouth moved, forming words without sound. Then I realized he was warning me. They all were. Their mouths moved in silent unison. Run. I ran. Somehow. Each step felt like moving through a physical barrier, but terror is a hell of a motivator. Behind me, they followed. Not chasing. They couldn't move fast enough for that. Just inexorably following. Like they knew I'd tire eventually. Like they remembered doing this very thing when they were still fully human, still capable of fear. One was closer than the others. The remains of a blonde beard clung to his chin in patches. His uniform was newer than the others. Couldn't have been out here more than a few months. His eyes met mine as I passed, and there was still something there. Something that remembered being someone. He reached for me with blackened fingers, not grabbing, but beseeching, wanting to tell me something, wanting to warn me. The sound that came from his throat wasn't words, just a low, continuous moan that might have been despair. I made it back to the tower. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the walkie-talkie twice before getting the new batteries in. Behind me, through the windows, I could see them gathering. Some stood perfectly still, faces upturned to my light. Others swayed gently, like seaweed in a current. A few simply sat where they stopped, as if they'd forgotten how to stand. Jabari? Jabari, please. Static. Then, here. His voice was barely a whisper. Bad night? What the fuck is happening here? A long pause. Just breathing. Then, should tell you, truth. I lied. On application. Have PhD, biochemistry. Knew they didn't want scientists, but needed job. The readings, bullshit, all of it. Each sentence seemed to cost him enormous effort. Soil resonance, meaningless term, air quality devices, just pretty toys. Water test patterns, random, found old records, in floorboards, letters, notes from previous watchmen. His breathing was getting worse. 8 generations, 8 towers, always moving, getting closer together, triangulating. Triangulating what? The source. Why we're all like this. A wet cough. They're measuring us, not the forest. Instruments are red herrings. Our dying bodies are the true reading. How fast we fade. How quickly we join them. The quicker we fade, the closer they are to finding it. Through the static, I heard papers rustling. Wrote it all down. Proper analysis. Soil probe generates random frequencies. Air quality meter just runs on clockwork. No actual sensors. But us? They measure everything. Weight loss, cognitive decline, energy depletion, the sound of something heavy falling. Jabari cursing weakly. Pattern in tower movements. Over decades. They take them down. Rebuild. With every missing watchman. Spiraling inward. Getting closer to finding what they're looking for. Watchmen in Tower 2. Last barely a week before they fade. A sound from outside made me jump. I stood and peeked through the expansive window. The watchmen were walking away now, disappearing into the thicket of the forest, like they'd given up, or knew it was too late for me. I tried to believe it was the former. Have to tell you. Jabari's voice was fading. Overheard sisters talking. One word, Belphegor. Do you know who that is? 'Cause it's not good. The name hit me like ice water. Catholic school lessons from years ago. Sister Mary Catherine's stern voice. Belphegor, demon prince of sloth, who draws men into the sin of spiritual apathy. Jabari, listen. We need to get out. Meet halfway. Help each other. Too late for me. His laugh turned into a wet cough. Haven't eaten. 2 weeks. Legs don't work anymore. Been using Dexies to stay awake. Almost out. Run. While you can. Get help. I can't leave you. Already gone. Just fighting the inevitable. Run. The static took over. I called his name 3 more times. Nothing. I threw whatever I could reach into my bag. Caffeine pills. Water. The journal I'd been keeping. My hands moved like they belonged to someone else, clumsy and slow. Each item felt impossibly heavy. Made it maybe 20 minutes into the forest before I found them. Or they found me. A perfect circle of former watchmen, standing in the pre-dawn light. Waiting. Some wore uniforms from different decades, a catalog of the bride's victims through the years. Most were so still they might have been statues, but a few swayed gently, like they were listening to some distant music only they could hear. The exhaustion hits me like a physical wave, but it's different this time. Final. It starts in my bones and radiates outward, turning my muscles to water, my thoughts to mist. My legs fold under me, and I know with terrible certainty that I will never stand again. I recognize this feeling now. It's not just tiredness. It's surrender. The same thing I've seen in the eyes of every wanderer in these woods. That moment when the last ember of will gutters out, when even breathing feels like too much effort, when existence itself becomes an unbearable weight. I should be terrified, should be fighting, but I understand now why none of them run, why they just stand and sway and wait. Fighting requires caring, and whatever's in these woods has drained that from me drop by drop, day by day. All that's left is a vast, empty acceptance. My mind is already starting to drift. Thoughts slip away before I can grasp them, like trying to hold smoke. But I have enough left, just enough, to write this down, to warn whoever finds it. The caffeine pills aren't working anymore. My hand can barely hold the pen. Looking at the page, I can see my handwriting deteriorating, the letters becoming shapeless, like my mind is forgetting how they're supposed to look. I think I'm going to rest now, just for a minute. There's a woman in white standing among the trees. She's watching me, smiling that serene smile they all share. It's like she knew I wouldn't make it till Sunday. Now that I know what they're looking for, I hope they don't find it. A stranger paid my cabin a midnight visit. She said we're being watched. A few weeks ago, I rented a cabin near Pitkin County, Colorado for a weekend getaway with my wife and daughter. For their privacy, I'll refer to my wife as Elena, and my daughter, who's between 4 and 8 years old, as Sophia. It was dusk by the time we arrived at the cabin, far later than Elena and I had planned. The afternoon's anticipation gone, the promise of a relaxing vacation already sullied, and my back sore from changing the tire which had been eviscerated by the forest road. The mood was thoroughly ruined. Maybe that should have been an indication as to how the rest of the trip would go. The cabin itself was beautiful and rustic. Nestled among the towering pines, the 2-story building blended into the surrounding woodlands with its dark-stained wooden siding and stone chimney. Large windows glistened with the last light of day, and the wraparound porch boasted a hanging patio swing much to Sophia's delight. She ran straight for it and started swinging as Elena and I carried the bags inside. When I unlocked the door and turned on the lights, I found myself surprised by the decor. In stark contrast to the classy, almost minimalist exterior of the cabin, the interior was remarkably cluttered. It was like every square surface, countertops, bookshelves, tables, etc., was covered in little trinkets. Tchotchkes, as my mother would have called them. There were coasters, candles, vintage oil lamps and compasses, and a bunch of wooden animal carvings, each about a foot tall, The interior wasn't dirty by any means, just more crowded than expected. I found it charming in a weird way, though Elena was less fond. I remember her taking a long look at the place and saying, "Interesting," which is her code for, "I don't like what I'm seeing, but I also don't want to make a big deal about it." It was past Sophia's bedtime, so after coaxing her off of the porch swing, I helped her get set up for the night. There were 2 bedrooms on the second floor, a master suite with an attached bathroom and a smaller bedroom that was pretty clearly set up as a kid's room for visitors to the cabin. The cabin was specifically advertised as family-friendly and good for parents with younger children, so it was no surprise when the smaller bedroom was full of colorful toys and plushies. There was a fireplace across from the bed, its mantel showcasing a full set of those wooden animal carvings. 1 moose, 1 bear, 1 trout, and so on. There was also one particularly large teddy bear sitting on the bed, partially buried under the covers like it was getting ready for bed. Sophia instantly fell in love, and I thought it was sweet that the cabin's owner had gone the extra mile to make the place welcoming. I didn't love the idea of her cuddling it to sleep, though, since it likely hadn't been washed between visits. So I propped it up on a chair next to the bed before tucking Sophia in for the night. Tired from our travels, Elena and I went to sleep not too long afterwards. Saturday was our designated lake day. After making breakfast and waking up Sophia, who had to be convinced not to take her new best friend Mr. Bear out on the water with us, we grabbed the kayaks off of our roof rack and headed down to the shore. We were a short walk from the lake, and I was absolutely blown away by the natural splendor. Our cabin was semi-isolated, remote enough to give my family peace and privacy, but close enough to civilization that we could easily access help in case of an emergency. We were a 5-minute drive into town and a 5-minute walk to the nearest neighboring cabin, which we passed on the way to the lake. It was a gorgeous building, far more intricate and seemingly much older than the one we were renting. There was an older woman sitting on the porch as we passed it by, and although I couldn't wave since both hands were full with the kayaks, I gave her a nod and a friendly smile. She stared at me in response, her expression completely blank. She was looking directly at me, but almost looked like she was in a trance or something. What was that all about? I quietly asked Elena once we were out of earshot. "Not sure," my wife answered. "She looks pretty settled in there. Maybe that's her home and she doesn't appreciate her neighbor running an Airbnb." That seemed a logical explanation. I stole a quick glance over my shoulder before the house completely disappeared behind us, and saw that the woman was now walking down the steps of her front porch, her gaze still fixed on us. Elena and I exchanged worried looks and picked up the pace a little, Sophia running along ahead of us, joyful and oblivious. Once we reached the shore, we hopped into the kayaks and pushed off into the water. We weren't exactly running away from the woman. It was more so that we wanted to avoid a confrontation if we could. As we started paddling out into the lake, the woman appeared at the tree line but never came any closer. I gave her a wave, and again she gave me no response but a glower. It occurred to me that she might have been trying to warn us about the lake, maybe about a current or algal bloom, but I'd researched the area extensively to make sure it was safe, and her demeanor wasn't quite urgent or benevolent enough for that to be the case. The rest of the day was thankfully devoid of any more strange encounters. After a calm day of swimming and hiking, we returned to the cabin in the evening for dinner and s'mores. Sophia brought Mr. Bear outside to help with the s'mores, to mine and Elena's amusement. We had no idea how we would convince her to leave the stuffed animal behind when we left on Monday night. After we put Sophia to sleep at 8 p.m., Elena and I watched a movie, had a drink, and then went to sleep at 10:30 or so. At midnight, according to my phone clock, I heard what sounded like a knock. I sat up in bed, checked the time, and listened for a minute. A few seconds passed, and then there came 3 knocks in quick succession. I gently shook Elena awake, waiting to hear the sound again, and after a moment I did. There was someone at the front door of the cabin in the middle of the night. Concerned, I got out of bed and tried to look out the bedroom window. I could only see a sliver of the front porch, and though I couldn't see an actual person, I could see the shadow of one thanks to the porch lights. Needless to say, I wasn't thrilled to have a stranger pay our isolated cabin a midnight visit. I told Elena to stay upstairs and made my way to the first floor, stopping by the living room to pull back the curtains ever so slightly and peer through the window. Still, given the shape of the house and the placement of the windows, it was impossible to see anything but a shadow. The person must have been standing an inch away from the front door. I scanned the front yard and the distant tree line but didn't see anyone else, so a decoy ambush situation seemed unlikely. But I still grabbed my handgun just in case. Just my luck. The old front door of the house didn't have a peephole, so I got up close to the door and tried talking to the person on the other end. "Can I help you?" I said. Instead of answering, the person knocked again, this time more urgently. No way in hell was I opening that door now. "Look, friend, if you need help, you better speak up. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to get off my damn porch before I call the police." The knocking stopped, and after a moment, there was a woman's voice on the other side of the door. Her tone was nervous and her voice was soft. She said a single sentence. "He's watching your daughter through the bear." Of all the things I expected to hear from our unwelcome visitor, that was not one of them. I readied my gun and cracked the door open. When I looked out into the night, I saw the elderly woman from earlier quickly shambling away from my door. Her back was turned towards me and she looked like she was trying to get away from my porch as quickly as she could. I called after her, asking her what she was talking about, but she didn't look back. She just kept going until the night swallowed her up completely. I was pretty disturbed at this point, so I shut and locked the door and made my way back upstairs. Elena was waiting for me at the top of the stairs, and I quietly explained to her what was going on. Horrified, she went into Sophia's room and gently took the teddy bear out of our sleeping daughter's arms. We went downstairs and laid the bear out on the kitchen counter. I grabbed a pair of kitchen shears and dissected the thing, making an incision in its fluffy body and pulling out its cotton innards. It wasn't that I believed the old woman, just that, as a parent, anything related to my kids' safety, even something that sounds outlandish, is something I take seriously. Even though the woman was likely suffering from some kind of cognitive impairment, I still wanted to investigate. I pulled all of the stuffing out of Mr. Bear and found nothing, though Elena pointed out that the bear had two very large glass eyes, which could potentially be concealing a small camera. I was unable to find a hammer, but I did find a wrench under the kitchen sink. I wrapped the eyes in a kitchen towel and smashed them to bits, but when I sorted through the fragments, I didn't see anything that looked like a recording device. I was relieved, but I was also equal parts creeped out and angry. Maybe, like Elena had mentioned earlier, she was annoyed with the constant visitors to her neighboring cabin and was trying to scare us off. She might also have had some mental health issues or hallucinations. In either case, though, how did she know about the teddy bear? Maybe she had visited the house before, or maybe it was just a lucky guess. Before returning to bed, I took a turn around both floors of the cabin, looking and failing to find anything out of the ordinary. Elena was also pretty freaked out, and she got up several times in the night to visit Sophia's room down the hall and make sure all was well. Needless to say, neither of us got much sleep that night. Sunday morning was all doom and gloom, which ended up being a perfect reflection of my daughter's attitude when she woke up and realized Mr. Bear was gone. Obviously, we didn't tell her what had happened, but Elena and I did our best to distract her with flapjacks and promises of a fun day of adventuring. Unfortunately, the hike we had planned was foiled by a downpour that, of course, the forecasts hadn't predicted, and so we decided to salvage the day by exploring the small town nearby. It wouldn't be the escape into nature we'd hoped for, but there were several family-owned restaurants and shops in the area, as well as a small library. The morning was all right. I enjoyed exploring the little town with my family, although there wasn't much to do. We had an early lunch at around 11 or so, but when we sat down, my wife started rifling through her backpack with a look of dismay. When I asked her what was wrong, she said that she didn't see Sophia's EpiPen, which we always like to have at the ready when we eat out. I realized immediately that I'd forgotten to put it back in Elena's backpack yesterday when I was reorganizing our stuff. I felt like such an idiot, and Elena, already grouchy from a sleepless night, really chewed me out for it. To make amends, I told her to wait with Sophia at the restaurant while I hurried back to the cabin for the EpiPen. She was displeased, but it felt like a better option than all of us braving the rain to return to the cabin. The drive back was an absolute nightmare. Sure, it was a short commute, but the dirt roads leading up to the cabin had turned to sludge in the heavy rain. I was in a foul mood when I entered the cabin. I shut the front door with a slam and made my way to the stairs. The house was dark thanks to the storm outside, dark enough that I almost missed the muddy shoe prints leading up the hardwood steps. When I saw them and realized what they were, I stopped in my tracks. I didn't have to wonder what they meant. Someone had been in the cabin since my family left, and judging by the fact that there was only one set of prints, they likely were still in the house with me at that very moment. I stood on the half landing, looking up at the second half of the staircase. The upper floor was eerily dark, so much so that someone could have been standing right at the edge of the staircase and I wouldn't have been able to see them. I carefully walked backwards down the stairs, keeping my eyes peeled in case any shape suddenly emerged from the darkness, and once I made it down the stairs, I turned around and ran outside. I sat in my car and called the police to report a break-in. After calling Elena to explain the situation, I sat in my car and watched the house until the police arrived, which took almost an unreasonable amount of time. I never saw any movement from inside the house, nor did I see anyone leave, though I didn't have a great visual on the back door. It's possible that the intruder could have slipped through the back and run straight for the woods, in which case the cabin would have obscured them. The police were shockingly curt and dismissive about the whole thing. One of the officers who arrived on scene asked me for proof of a break-in, as if I would have had time to snap a picture of the intruder in my house or something. They did a sweep of the cabin and found no one inside, but even so, I didn't want my wife and daughter to set foot in that building again. I texted Elena, telling her I was going to pack up our stuff and that we should leave a night early, and she agreed. The cops stayed with me as I packed to give me some peace of mind, which I appreciated. Aside from the shoe prints, there weren't any obvious signs of a break-in, and strangely, nothing of value had been stolen, even though I'd left my laptop laying out in plain sight. Thankfully, we'd packed light, so it didn't take me long to grab all of our stuff from the master bedroom and the bathrooms. My last stop was Sophia's room, where I was quickly able to locate and pack all of her things. Nothing of Sophia's had been stolen or tampered with, but there was something missing from the fireplace mantel. Right in the center, there was a circular impression in the fine layer of dust, indicating that a certain figurine had recently been separated from its wooden brethren. Someone had taken the bear.